In this third part of the Godot Tower Defense series, we'll build our first user interface. We'll make a main game menu where the player can select new game, and we'll have a look at how to transition from one scene to another. Let's get started. For the assets, we're going to continue using Kenny.nl's asset packs because they're simply amazing. On his website, make sure you go to Assets, User Interface, and grab yourself Game Icons, Kenny Fonts, UI Pack, and UI Pack Space Expansion. Again, don't throw all of it in your project folder. We'll select a couple of assets in this tutorial, and we'll probably add a couple more as we go along in this series. In Godot, in the file manager on the bottom left, we can see which assets we're going to be using in this tutorial. Under my assets folder, I've created a new folder fonts where I've added the Kenny Future Narrow.ttf font from the font pack. Under my UI map, under a new folder buttons, I have added 3 buttons from the UI pack, the blue button 3, 5, and 12. And under just UI, I've taken the cursor pointer 3D shadow from the space expansion pack. Now, I've also, under this art folder right here, created a background. I simply created this background in PowerPoint and then exported the sheet as a PNG file, but I also make sure there's a download link from my Google Drive to that particular file, so you can use that one if you don't want to make a background yourself. Okay, now let's start making a main menu with these assets. We're going to go over to Scene and we select New Scene, and we're going to create a user interface scene. Obviously, that's going to give us this control node that is already sized to the viewport, to the full size of the screen. And that's good, we want that. We're going to rename this to main menu so we actually know what it is. And we're going to be starting with adding the background texture. So we add a child, and we're going to use a texture rectangle for that. Now, the texture rectangle, when it comes into the scene, you can see it's a very small rectangle, and of course we want this background to fill up the entire screen. We can easily do that with layout, full rectangle. That is going to set the size of this node equal to the full rectangle size of the parent. And since the parent was already the full viewport, the full screen size, texture rectangle is as well now. Now we can rename this. I'm going to rename this to just the B of background, so that if ever we need to reference this in code, our node paths stay nice and short. Now I'm going to set expand on in the inspector here in the parameters. That's going to make sure that when we drag a texture to the texture field here, the rectangle doesn't resize itself based on the texture size, but is going to be scaling that texture to the rectangle size that we have determined here by just setting full rectangle on the layout. Now we can drag the texture rectangle here to the texture field, and bam, there is our background. Now we can start adding elements, but we don't want our elements to start touching the edge of the screen. That wouldn't look nice. In order to make sure that that never happens, we can add a margin container. So under the main menu, we're going to add a child that is going to be a margin container that again starts as a small rectangle. We are again going to use layout full rectangle, and under the custom constants of the margin container, we're going to say that we want 50 pixels of padding or margin around the entire screen, around the entire border. Now this doesn't show up right now because we'll need to add elements first. Let's do that, and before we do, let's rename this to the M of margin container. We'll add a child node, and we want to add, of course, a couple of buttons, but these buttons need to be organized nicely in a vertical way, and of course we would ideally have functions that allow us for exact spacing between these buttons without too much problems. We can do that with a VBox container. A VBox container, and also HBox containers for that matter, are going to help us, and the VBox container controls the positioning of all the nodes that are inside of it. So you don't set any of the positions or the rectangles of the margins or nodes that you put inside this VBox container, but you're going to set up the parameters in such a way that the VBox container can organize these nodes automatically. And that's really easy for example, if you're developing for mobile, when you have different screen sizes, then the VBox container is just going to apply the same rules every single time. Doesn't matter what screen size it is. So very powerful node that you will use very often. I'm going to rename this to VB, again, to keep our node path short. And now you can see with the orange border that's indicating the size of this VBox container, that the margin container with our 50 pixels of padding is forcing this VBox container to take on this size and not expand towards the border of the screen. So now we automatically have that margin. With this VBox container, I think it would look nice if the menu, the buttons, are on the right hand side of the panel, and that leaves some space for you to add another texture or a piece of art about the game or a scene or something like that. I'll leave that up to you. So with the VBox container, we don't want this to take the full horizontal space that it currently does. And the reason why it does so is because of the size flags parameters right here. It says that it's going to horizontally fill up the space. And we don't want this. We want this to actually shrink to the end. So we're going to turn this one off. I'm going to shrink it to the end, but now you can see it's just a vertical line. It's now 1 pixel wide. And now on a rectangle, we can say, no, we want you to be at least, for example, 500 pixels wide. So now our menu buttons are going to be over here. Now that we have this box that we can put buttons in, let's build some buttons. We right click the VBox container. We're going to add a new child node and we're going to look for texture button. The texture button allows you to add multiple textures to this button that are going to change the appearance of this button under certain conditions. Now, before I can demonstrate that to you, we first have to make sure the button actually becomes visible, because now it's only 1 pixel in height. So with the texture button selected, we're going to go to rectangle and we're going to say that it needs to be at least under minimum size 75 pixels high. So this height is good, but I think it's a little bit too wide. It's currently 500, but we probably want this to be about 350. I'm going to set that in the minimum size and not in the size parameters here on the top, because remember, the VBox container determines how this node is positioned and size. So we cannot change the size parameters directly. It will just reset itself as soon as we would play the game. So we're going to set the minimum size of 350, and in the size flags we tell the VBox container the behavioral rules of how he can position the nodes within its own container. So we're going to set horizontal not to fill, but to shrink to the center, and now our button has become 350 wide. Now that we have our button, we can start dragging out texture, and I'll also demonstrate to you how that expand is functioning. So we're going to drag blue button 3 to the normal textures. And as you can see, when we keep expand off, it's just going to take the size of the actual texture that you have dragged. If we turn expand on, it's going to automatically, with stretch mode scale, fill the entire node with that texture. So that's exactly what we want. Now we drag blue button number 5 to the pressed parameter. And now if we play the scene, we probably have to save the scene first. Yes, we do. Yes, we want to save the scene. We're going to save that under our scenes, under UI scenes. I'm going to save it as main menu. And now you can see when I click this button, you can see that the texture is slightly changing. That's because these textures are almost the same, but they're giving the player the feedback that yes, you actually clicked it. The game is not lagging. Maybe you're loading a big scene, and this just gives that game that little bit of extra feel that we're usually seeking as game developers. So that is working fine. Now we just need to make sure that we can name our button. So we're going to right click our texture button and we're going to add a label to it. That again starts very small here. We're going to use again layout full rectangle. We're going to add some text. Let's say new game. And of course this looks absolutely horrible. Let's start by aligning this both horizontally and vertically to the center. But of course we want the font to be bigger, and to be honest, just the font doesn't look great. The default font that Godot comes with is not awesome. There's 2 ways that you can change fonts and the style of all these different elements. The more high-level abstract, and especially if you're working on a big game, preferred method is using themes. Now, themes is just a topic that is too deep for this tutorial series. That's like a whole episode of like 1.5 hours by itself. This is a smaller game, so the second way is perfectly fine for us. We're just going to define the dynamic font and we're going to save it so that we can reuse it multiple times in the game. We don't have a lot of UI, we don't have a lot of text, we don't have a lot of labels, so that will be fine for now. But if you start working on a big game, do research the theme possibilities of Godot, as they'll definitely help you out. Okay, so we're going to change the font. So we're going to go under custom fonts. We're going to create a new dynamic font. That doesn't really change a lot, but now if we click into this by clicking dynamic font here 1 time, we're going to get 4 tabs here, and under the third tab, font, we can add the font data. Now here we can load the font that we have downloaded from Kenny's assets. So we're going to go to assets, to fonts, and we're going to select Kenny Future Narrow. And now you can see that we've changed our font. Now there's a lot of options we can still give it. So we're going to close the font tab here. I'm going to go into the settings. We can set the size, for example. Let's set it to 40. Now currently it's pixelated. If you don't like that, you can turn on the filter. If you use filter, you make sure that the pixelation goes away. Now it's always nice to have a little bit of an outline. The outline is now white. That doesn't look that great. Let's set that to black, but that's probably going to be a little bit too strong. So let's make the outline transparent. So we're going to add a little bit of transparency to the outline. And this already looks pretty good. What we can do more is under custom colors. We can also set a shade, and that is then going to add more depth to it. So now we have got sort of two different colors in the outline. We've got the outline itself and the shade. Now the shade is probably a little bit too strong, so I'm going to turn that down to 180 transparency, and I think that's a pretty good feel. Now we probably want to reuse this font now and then, so I'm going to go over to the custom font, the dynamic font here. I'm going to save that. That will save the settings of this dynamic font in a resource file so you can reuse it in the future. I'm going to save that under my folder resources that I've created. And here I've got the folder fonts, and here I'll save it. Now we know that this is the what was it? The Kenny Future Narrow. So maybe I'll abbreviate that, Kenny Future Narrow. And I'll mention the size that this particular dynamic font is. So this was a size 40, and this was an outline of 1. So I'll also add outline 1. So now if I have multiple fonts saved, or multiple dynamic fonts that we may make with Kenny Future Narrow, for example, we got one for a size 40, a size 25, a size 15. If ever I add another label to the game and I want to size that to the same style that I've used before, I can recognize through the naming convention which one I can choose or which one I need to pick. So let's save that so we can reuse that in the future. So now that we have our new game button, let's rename the node to new, if you can still type new game. And now of course we want more buttons. And this is something that you probably should get accustomed to. If you need to have multiple of something, try and make the base version as good as it should get. And then you can duplicate this. So I'm going to select the new game node, and with Ctrl D, I'm going to duplicate, and I'll just duplicate 3 more buttons into the game here. And now we can just quickly rename this. You probably want to have a settings page where the player can set various settings. We probably want to have an about page where we can brag about our game studio and how awesome it is. And then if we have scared away the player with all our bragging, we need to make sure that the player is able to quit. So now we have 4 buttons, but it still doesn't look amazing. So now under the VBox container, we can set the VBox container, we can give the VBox container, I should say, more parameters with how it needs to resize the nodes that it has within itself. So for example, we can say, well, how about you align the buttons that we've just added to you to the center? And for example, under the custom constants, we can say, you know what, make sure you got 50 separation. That's maybe a little bit too much. Maybe you got about 35 separation between all these buttons. And let's say maybe we also want the quit button to have a little bit more separation from the rest, so it stands out a little bit, so that, you know, maybe players don't click it too quickly. We can add another child to the VBox container. That can just be a control node. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. We're going to drag this control node between about and quit. And this control node is already going to get the 35 separation from the HBox container. But if you want that to be a little bit more separation, you simply go to the rectangle, set the minimum Y size to, for example, 20 pixels or 35, and then you can dictate how much space there needs to be between a certain group of buttons and for example, in this case, the quit button. So now we have a little bit of a main game menu, and I guess now it's time that we can start adding some functionality and start switching some scenes. So when the game actually plays, you can click new game, and that's actually going to transport you to the test map that we have already been building in the previous episodes. We're going to be switching over to our scene handler scene, one of the first scenes we've built, and well, we haven't really done much with it yet, and that's going to change all now. The scene handler under the project settings, we've already set this under the run tab to be the first scene that's loaded when the game starts running. And of course, when the game starts running, we want to display the main menu. So we're going to right click our scene handler. Now we're going to instance in a child scene. We're going to look for our main menu and we instance in the entire scene that we have just built. Now we need to connect these buttons up. We want the new game to load a new game scene. That's a node we don't have yet, or a scene we don't have yet. And of course, we want quit to quit the entire game. We could connect these buttons through the graphical user interface of the editor, but we would only be able to connect them conveniently to, for example, a script on the main menu. And it's the scene handler that is handling the scenes, so including what needs to happen when we press new game and quit. So we're going to connect these buttons through code instead of using the graphical user interface. We're going to select our scene handler and we're going to add a new script to it. We'll create that, and we want that these buttons are connected once this scene, the scene handler scene, has finished loading. When it's finished loading, it's gonna trigger the ready function to run. So on the ready, we're gonna get the button that we want to connect. So we're gonna get the node, main menu. We need to get the margin container, VBox container, and then we need the new game. There it is. And we're gonna select that button, and we're gonna connect that button's pressed signal to this script, to self, and we're going to connect it to the function on new game pressed. And now our button, when we click it, is going to run the function on new game pressed, and there it is. Now we want to have the same happen pretty much, but then with our quit button. So we're going to replace quit here, and of course then we want on quit pressed, and then we also need a function for on quit pressed, and we can immediately code that. That's really easy. We're just going to get the tree and we are going to quit. And just like that, we are now have the ability to press that button and quit the game. It's as easy as that. Now on new game pressed, we want the main menu to disappear, and we don't want to hide that or anything. We just want it to be completely rid of the scene tree so that it doesn't take any resources, doesn't take any memory, so that we have more memory available for the main game itself. And we want the game scene to come in, but we don't have a game scene yet. So let's quickly work on that. Right now we do have a map scene, but we have of course map 1, map 2, map 3, or however you want to call your maps. And the map needs to be loaded into a game scene that is going to be handling the game logic. So we want the game logic to be on the game scene level, and then the map logic can be on the map level. Now that is maybe a little bit complex to understand right now, but as we go along in this series, this will become more and more clear to you. So we're going to create a new scene that is also going to be a 2D scene. The 2D scene is going to be our game scene, and in our game scene we are going to be instancing in our map number 1 scene that we've already created in the last tutorial. And this is all we need right now. We just need to make sure that we have this game scene container so that the scene handler can actually load it in. So we'll save this, and we'll save this under our scenes. We already have our main scenes folder, and that's where our game scene will go. Now we can go back to the scene handler, we can go to the script, and we can say, okay, we need to first clear our game menu. So we'll just borrow a little bit of code right here. We're gonna get node main menu, and we are going to free this up on the next available frame. Then we need to load that game scene as a resource. So we need a var game scene. That is going to be load, and then between quotes we're going to approach in the file manager on the bottom left here the gamescene.tscn. We're going to right click it, we're going to copy that path, and we'll paste that in here. So now we're loading that scene up, but now it's still a packed scene. We need to instance it so that we can actually use it. So we do that with the instance command. Now with game scene, we can now add the child, and since we are writing this code on the scene handler, we're just adding this as a child underneath scene handler. So we're going to add child, and then we take game scene. Now when we play the game, so now I'm for the very first time using the play button and not the play scene button, there's a difference there. Our game opens up, we can use the quit button to quit the game, and we would be able to use the new game button to load the map up, and this is loading, well, the code that we've previously already made that our turrets are looking at our mouse cursor. Now that you got some basic UI functionality and some scene switching, let's spice it up a little bit and remove this ugly Windows cursor for something that fits the game a little bit more. We can easily do that in the project settings. We're going to search in the search bar here for cursor. We're going to click mouse cursor on the display category, and here we got custom image. We click this little folder icon. We're going to navigate to assets, UI, cursor pointer 3D that we got out of the Kenny UI space expansion pack. We'll add that to it, and now when we play the game, we now have a cursor that fits with the game style, just like that. Next up, in the I want to add a couple of UI elements, not too many, to the head-up display under this game scene. In the next tutorial, we're going to be working with building the towers. We're going to need a UI for that anyway, to click something to actually build a tower. And since that tutorial is probably going to be a little bit lengthy because that's a little bit more complex in code, let's add the UI elements for it right now. So we'll close this, we'll switch over to the game scene, and on game scene I'm going to add a new child node. Now the node that I'm going to be using is a canvas layer. The canvas layer is a node that you can use to put all your head-up displays and all your UI panels during a gameplay session. The canvas layer is always projected in front of everything else, and it's always going to be following wherever the camera goes. It's always displayed in the full view of the camera. So we're gonna rename this. We'll rename this to UI, and I'll add a control node to this because I want the HUD to be in a separate category. So a control node, we're gonna rename this to HUD. And again, we get this small rectangle with layout full rectangle. We make sure that it takes the full size of the screen. Now you can add as we go along in this tutorial series. If you, for example, have a pop-up panel or something like that, it's usually handy to put that in another container so that if you have, for example, an inventory and at that point you want to hide the HUD elements, you can very easily do so by in the code setting show visible yes or no. Now under the HUD, we're gonna make this pretty easy. We're gonna add a new VBox container. We're gonna build a build bar. Let's call it like that. And as I say it, let's just do that. It's going to be the build bar. It's just like a skill bar, but this time it's going to be where you build your towers from. Now the build bar, let's give it a little bit of a logical size, probably something 100 in width and maybe 400 in height. And it's probably going to look good if we put this in the lower corner on the left button. So we're going to put that bottom left. Now we got our VBox container right here. This is where we are going to add a texture button that we can click when we want to build a tower. And for example, the first tower can be the gun turret. We're going to set the rectangle size to 80 by 80. That fits nicely in our VBox container. That's 100 in width. Then under the size flags, we'll tell it to shrink to the center. And under the textures with expand on, I'll drag my blue button 12 to the normal texture. I don't have a texture prepared so that when you press the button you can see the difference, because when you press this button and you want to build that tower, we're gonna add a tower image to the mouse cursor so that you have the feedback that you're actually in the build process or in the build mode. So we're not going to add any feedback to the button itself, as we will be adding more than enough feedback to the player to its cursor basically. So with this, we probably want, of course, give the player a little bit like, okay, what you're actually building. In this case, I'm not going to use a label. I'm going to use a texture rectangle that we're just going to add a texture of the actual tower. Now, I don't have any specific thing prepared. I'm going to set it to full rectangle. I'll probably rename this to icon, so it's generic. Then we'll probably just use on the towers, let's just use the actual texture of the tower itself, like that. And maybe we want this to have a little bit of margin, so that's probably going to be about 10 around, so that is 10 for left and top and -10 for right and bottom. And that way our icon is now spaced within this button. We can duplicate this gun, we can rename this to missile, and on the icon we can drag the missile icon in here. And just like that, we have two buttons. We might want to have a little bit of custom constants, separation, maybe about 25 to put these apart a little bit. And just like that, we have 2 buttons that we will be able to click. We're going to build the functionality for that in the next tutorial, but pretty much everything is prepared to dive straight into the code in that next tutorial that's going to be coming up next week. And there you go. Now you got a couple of UI elements added to your game, a main menu with the functionality for the quit button and scene switching functionality for new game that's going to load in our test map. We've added some UI elements to the head-up display of the game scene already, so we're ready for that next tutorial. If you like this video, then please smash that like button and hit subscribe. Don't forget that bell icon to make sure you don't miss out on that video. I hope to see you then, and until then, keep on gaming, keep on coding. See you later, guys.